What's up guys, Anfield here and welcome to a new video. Today's video we're going to talk about 5 things that I think could be changed about the game in terms of mechanics or in balance. Now, the things I'm going to talk about in this video aren't the commonly discussed things such as artillery, gold rounds, or matchmaker. It's none of that, so it's just going to be kind of less talked about subjects that I think could have some light shed on them. And there's lots of things that I'm not going to include in this video that could also be worth a shout here too, so of course let me know at the end of the video what you would like to be looked at as well. And of course if you disagree with me, you can also let me know as well. So let's get right into the list. Now, these are in no particular order, but let's start things off with RNG. Now, in particular, RNG on penetration. Now, obviously, RNG is at least talked about quite a bit, specifically when it comes to how it affects the esports side of the game and other things. So it's not uncommonly talked about, perhaps not as common as some other things. But I want to specifically focus on the penetration side of it because it's something that not only do I believe 25% is far too extreme for it, but I don't think it needs to have an RNG element to it. And what I'm saying is, why do we have RNG on penetration? I think it would be much better if you remove the RNG aspect. If you have 270 penetration, you should have 270 penetration. You shouldn't have 25% either side of that. This leads to situations where you might shoot someone in a spot and then have the exact same shot bounce off the next time around. It's ridiculous and shouldn't really be something that's in the game as far as I'm concerned. It seems unnecessary to me. I understand RNG on other things like damage because you don't want damage to always be the same. A little bit of variation is fine. Although perhaps 25% again is too severe. Perhaps 10% would be better. I don't know. But ultimately when it comes to penetration, it just seems unnecessary to me. It just adds an element of uncertainty to the game that doesn't need to be there. You know, when you're playing tanks like the E100 with such limited amounts of penetration anyway, you really don't want to have to be thinking, well, if I use this round, it might pen, it might also bounce. It has the potential to do both, so you're forced to use the heat round to be safe. You shouldn't really ever be in a situation like that. So, me personally, RNG on penetration seems a bit silly. Now, continuing this sort of RNG theme here, I want to talk about accuracy next. And obviously, there's been changes to accuracy over the years. We've had the 8.6 change, which had the Sigma changes. You had shells more likely to land to the center of the reticle. Wargaming sort of reversed that a couple patches ago. I don't remember when, so it's not the same as it used to be in that sense. But ultimately, you have to be careful with accuracy because you can't make everything perfectly aiming. It doesn't really work when you have inaccurate tanks. But the changes I'd kind of like to see is perhaps every hit you make that's successful, your accuracy gains a little bit of percentage better, like a tiny little bit. So when you get to endgame situations, there isn't as much RNG at the end of the game as there is at the beginning of the game, so that if you've hit a couple successful shots, you should be rewarded. The other thing you could perhaps do as well is you maybe have 100% accuracy after a successful hit if you don't change the shot. It's kind of ridiculous when you shoot the exact same spot and you hit, and then you change absolutely nothing, and then you miss the same shot. So perhaps a little bit that could be changed there. So next up is something that I talk about frequently on the stream, and that's cap fasting. Now obviously I joke around a lot about cap fasting, but there is something that I think is worthy of discussion here, and I want to kind of flesh out more of what my opinion is on cap fasting and what can be changed. So essentially it's the issue where people are able to cap very quickly on maps, and it's very difficult to come back and defend, or you're in a too slow of a tank and you're already committed to a flank and there's literally no way you could even make it in time, or if you do try to turn around, it's just way too vulnerable in terms of you just expose yourself to enemies that you're dealing with on your own flank. So there's issues where light tanks or medium tanks run in and they sit on the cap. Now, why people are quite content in this game to sit in a circle rather than shoot people, which is, you know, what kind of how I feel World of Tanks is shooting tanks and not so much sitting in a circle. I don't know, but it's very frustrating, especially when it ends battles really early and there's nothing you can do about it, because a lot of defending the cap is also kind of relying on your teammates to do a job. You need to rely on your teammates to defend. You can't always be in that position yourself to defend, or perhaps again you're not fast enough or you're currently tied down. There's also a lot of bases that give cappers really good shields, so even if you could make it back in time, they've got like destructible buildings on there shielding them, or actual solid objects or like even like big bushes where they can sit behind. It gets really frustrating, and that doesn't even cover the other half where your team is winning quite handedly and you have a couple guys on your team that have done absolutely nothing in the entire battle to help your team into this winning position, and they sit on the cap rather than allow you to continue to clean up the enemy force, doing lots of damage, getting lots of experience out of the game, lots of credits. So that's another avenue of frustration that you can get from cap fasting. And that's not to say that all capping is bad, because it's not. There's a strategic value to capping, specifically when it comes to an end of a battle and you're using it to set up a trap, or you're using it to force the enemy to make a decision to come back and defend, or to continue pushing your allies. There's all sorts of things that make sense at the end of a battle, and you can get value from that. You respect that kind of decision. It's just the super fast capping, or the people on your team, the cap when you're clearly winning and they just, I don't know. Very frustrating in that sense. Fortunately, I think in this case, the solutions are relatively easy. You could do one or two things, or a combination of both, and that's that you could prevent people from capping early and allow people to only begin to cap after a certain time has expired in the battle, say like 8 minutes in a standard battle, and then you can cap. I think it should definitely be something that wargaming should view as a last resort. I think this game is about shooting tanks, and I think capping is something that should only come in at the end of the battle as a sort of extra win condition. So that's another thing you could do. The other thing you could do is prevent people from capping so quickly by preventing the cap speed from going up so fast. In standard battles, even with just one person, it really does not take that long. With 3 people, it goes up so fast. I think assault and encounter speeds are much, much better. So if those could be implemented into a standard battle, it would be a little bit fairer, especially for those heavy tanks that take a while to get back. You know, if you make that effort as a Mouse or an E100, you shouldn't have to be punished by the fact that it's just way too fast and your tank is way too slow. And that way, it's less of a problem where you have to rely on your teammates that are faster to go do it for you. You can do it personally and make sure it happens. Obviously, there are other issues where there's maps that should not be so easy with cover on, there's like big bushes, destructible buildings, or even solid cover on caps that people can hide behind. I don't think that's a good idea, but the other two solutions I think will work quite well. You could of course implement the encounter system where if someone else is in the cap, you can't cap. So let's say you're on a standard battle, someone's capping your base, but in a really defensive position, perhaps you can sit on the cap too, and that'll prevent them from immediately capping and pause the capping speed for the time being. So the next thing I want to talk about is Tank Destroyer Alpha. Now, when it comes to taking a massive amount of damage, obviously we're usually focused on artillery and that kind of mechanic itself, but not a lot is said, or as much is said, about the tank destroyers that have massive alpha. Now, obviously one of the defining features of a tank destroyer usually is having alpha, or at least higher alpha than those of its medium tanks or heavy tank counterparts. But generally what I'm referring to here is the 750 range all the way up to the JP100 and 183 sort of ranges. 750 alpha itself isn't usually that bad. I think sometimes obviously the 25% rolls can make it quite bad. I think more 10% will be more reasonable for that, but I certainly think 750 is far too high for a tier 8 tank such as the ISU or the Borsig to have. I think that's a bit extreme in that particular case, but even when you look at the tier 10s, I think 750 can be quite punishing. When you look at guns like the 263 has, or the Jagdtiger that are 500 range, those are much more reasonable guns. When you're hit by these guns, you don't necessarily feel like your battle is suddenly over because half of your hit points are now gone, which is really the critical point here. It's very, very frustrating to lose a huge portion of your hit points, and the other problem is it doesn't really take a great deal of skill for a tank destroyer to pull this off. For a medium tank and heavy tank to pull this off, they generally have to fire multiple times. That means hitting more shots and being able to penetrate more shots, as well as also have to worry about being shot back because obviously they're mostly on the front lines, whereas the tank destroyers usually aren't. Most tier 10 medium tanks and heavy tanks have around 400 alpha, and I think that's a really healthy amount of damage. It's a good amount of damage, but not so much that it's really punishing for those that get hit. If you make a mistake against a tank destroyer, it can be really severely punishing, and it's not always your fault, or sometimes the map just forces you to go down a funnel where you have no choice, there's no cover, there's no alternative, and you're going to get punished for a lot of your hit points. I mean, a tank destroyer on its own can often hold up an entire flank because no one wants to take that initial hit, and why would you? It's a huge amount of damage you're going to take. Most other games that I've played have always sort of featured some high alpha weapon that no one really likes and always associates with noobs, and unfortunately tank destroyers kind of fill into that bracket, because a lot of these TDs now, they have high alpha and they can't be played that aggressively. Well, they can, but they're much more difficult. It's much more challenging to do so. It's much easier for a lot of people to sit in one spot and just do nothing until you have a target. And in this regard, they're really not that different from artillery in how they play and how they shut down a lot of maps. Sure, they don't get to use indirect fire like artillery, but they are much more accurate. So with the extreme changes Wargaming made on the sandbox, I don't think it's unreasonable to just take a look at Tank Destroyer Alpha, or like I did in the other video where I talked about, a potential global HP buff. That could be something that could be looked at too, because obviously if you had more HP, losing massive amounts of damage for one particular tank isn't the end of the world. Plus, of course, we've had a lot of issues recently, or at least personally I feel like a lot of battles ending very, very quickly. So if tanks had more hit points, obviously then the battles would last a little bit longer. But in general, I know obviously there are a lot of people that really, really love their TDs and will be really mad at me for suggesting any kind of changes to them, even changes that could potentially make them better by lowering alpha, but increasing their speed, gun traverse, and other aspects of the tanks. But this is just something that personally I believe should be looked at. So finally, I want to talk about HE based tanks. This is something that sort of comes up on the stream quite frequently and also follows the RNG element we were talking about earlier. So what do I mean by HE based tank? Well, essentially it's any tank that is primarily reliant on HE as its primary damage shell. So what we're really talking about are tanks like the Japanese heavies that use HE, the KV-2, the T-49 that obviously slings HE, and then also tanks like the 183 and the FE-4005. But the tanks that I want to focus on specifically are the T-49, the 183, and the FE-4005, because these are the tanks that are relevant to the higher tiers. So obviously HE as a general mechanic is fine, I don't really have a problem with it. It's just when it's actually supposed to be the damaging round for that tank, the tank is designed around it, such as the HESH with the 183 or with the HE that the T-49 carries. You're not really supposed to use the other rounds. The tank is really built around using the HE base shell. So my problem with HE is kind of twofold. Firstly, it's just RNG. Obviously you can aim for weak points, and with the 183 you still have a decent amount of pen on the HE round, making it very, very lethal if it pens, and it can just do a huge amount of damage. I mean, the 183 can one-shot a lot of other tier 10s, and I don't think there should be ever a situation where that occurs. Obviously you have ammo racks, but like from a thing that is just the normal shell, I don't think that should be really possible. But obviously, you still need an RNG roll to get that penetration. You can roll low and not pen, but still do a lot of damage and other things like that, which are kind of a problem. The other RNG aspect that comes into these tanks, other than their accuracy, which is usually quite poor, is also the fact that it's kind of RNG whether they kill crew members and damage modules, because that's what HE does. It's really good at that kind of thing, and that's just RNG. It's not like you usually aim for that stuff and be like, oh, I'm going to knock this guy's driver, gun, or whatever out. It's just luck. I mean, that's all it is, and that's why it's quite frustrating, because, it's really annoying to have an HE-based tank hit you, not only take hit points from you regardless of what you do, but also potentially kill quite a lot of your tank off. My final issue with having an HE-based round is that when you encourage someone to fire only HE, it's just, no matter how well you angle your tank, you play your tank, as long as they can hit you, they're going to do quite a bit of damage, especially when you look at the 183, because that thing will still hit you hard even if it doesn't penetrate. And that's really frustrating because you can't outplay your opponent. I mean, you can try and not be hit, but that's not always possible. Especially when you have a heavily armored slow tank and you're trying to outplay someone and you get hit by a 183, it's just like, well, even if they don't pen me, they could kill a ton of my crew. They're going to do damage regardless, and it can be quite a lot of damage still. And I think that this encourages an easy kind of gameplay that really doesn't require any effort. And obviously you have the T-49, which just rolls around at very high speeds, snapping shots and hitting you, and sometimes hitting you very, very hard. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of it, and I know that a lot of people really like to play the 183 and the T-49. They're really big gimmick tanks, and people really enjoy that kind of thing. But when you're looking at balancing a game and making it fun for everyone and trying to remove as much frustration and taking as much things out of people's hands, you want to limit the amount of RNG mechanics you have, and unfortunately, these two are quite heavily RNG. So that about does it for the things that I want to talk about here. These are just things that cross my mind while I'm playing the game, and ultimately what I want from a game is to have the least amount of frustrating mechanics as possible. You play a game to enjoy it, not to be constantly angry and frustrated by it. So all this really is me having just a bit of a vent about the things that I think are negatively affecting the game but aren't necessarily talked about too frequently. I appreciate, of course, there'll be many differing opinions, so I look forward to reading those comments as well. So let me know what you would have put in this list. Try to steer away from things that are commonly talked about and stick to the things that you really feel affect you personally that no one really talks about.